Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire for tonight's event. We really appreciate you joining us, and for those of you watching the replay of this, thank you for taking the time to engage with this discussion. I know that this is a difficult time for all of us with the various challenges out there, and I hope you are adjusting to our new normal. The World Affairs Council of New Hampshire is a nonprofit, nonpartisan membership organization working to bring the world to New Hampshire and New Hampshire to the world. We achieve this goal through speakers programs such as this, as well as through a State Department International Visitor Exchange Program and a Global High School Trivia Challenge. We hope that through our programs, people better understand the challenges facing the world today and how they may affect your own personal life. As a membership organization, we are supported by our members and donors. It is through their generosity that we can continue the efforts of the Council, and we thank everyone for building this amazing global community. If you are not already a member, we hope that you will consider joining the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire to ensure our programs, which you so enjoy, continue on. You can also choose to donate to the Council here on our website or by texting 4422321, text WACNH. In addition, we are a nonpartisan organization and therefore do not support or endorse any political candidate, policy, or idea. We provide these programs as an opportunity for you to hear from top international experts on top international affairs. We hope that you draw your own conclusions based on the information presented here. Therefore, please note that the comments and opinions tonight are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect those of the Council, its board, staff, members, supporters, or donors. Speaking of donors, I wanted to take a moment to thank especially the World Affairs Councils of America, the Wunderbar Together program, the Goethe Institute, and the German Federal Foreign Office for your help in making this event possible. We are so grateful for all you do for US-German relations. Finally, I wanted to mention that after our speakers' remarks tonight, we will be hosting a moderated Q&A. Please send us your questions throughout the evening through our social media channels, our council email, or through the chat function on our website. Without further ado, I would like to introduce tonight's speaker, Cathryn Clüver Ashbrook. Ms. Clüver Ashbrook is a German and American national, as well as the founding executive director of the Future of Diplomacy project at the Harvard Kennedy School, which examines the challenges to negotiation and statecraft in the 21st century. In January of 2018, she was named executive director of the Project on Europe and the Transatlantic Relationship. In her current role, she examines negotiation practice, international conflict mitigation, and the impact of technology and communication on diplomatic and non-governmental actors, as well as spearheads the project's Metro Diplomacy Initiative, which looks at the international role of cities. In this capacity, she has advised foreign ministries and international organizations across the globe on questions of digital strategy and institutional reform, as well as served as an expert panelist at several of the top international institutes. Ms. Clüver Ashbrook is also an expert commentator for German television and will be leaving Germany later this week to help German audiences better understand the US election on November 3rd. Thank you, Ms. Clüver Ashbrook, for joining us.
Well, Tim, it's such a pleasure to be with you. And though I'm only in Cambridge, Massachusetts, I must say that I miss not being with you in person because I so value the interactions that I've had with the different World Affairs Councils that I've been privileged to speak at and with. And I think you mentioned the particular emphasis that every World Affairs Council has on the next generation. And so I want to say a particular welcome to those who might be joining us who are still in high school or in their early years of college, who are interested in international relations and international affairs, because I think it's a critical time for our young people to be engaged in these questions and to be engaged with an organization such as yours, Tim. So I want to thank you. I want to thank Michael Pappas, the events coordinator of the World Affairs Council in New Hampshire. I want to thank Bill Clifford, the president and CEO of the World Affairs Councils of America, for having me here. And of course, as a German American, I would be remiss in not expressing my gratitude for this now 2-year initiative that the German Foreign Office and its cultural institutions have put together, Wunderbar Together 2020, to underline what binds us as Germans and Americans over the arc of history, culture, science and innovation, and of course, people-to-people contacts. And as Tim mentioned, I am a product of that transatlantic relationship. My mother is an American who spent 42 years working for the US government in my hometown, Wiesbaden, Germany, as a teacher in the Department of Defense dependent schools, and married a German. And lo and behold, here I am. So this conversation this evening, if you will, is a passion project, but it's also really something that has become much more a focal point of my work in the way that I didn't think it would be when I set out in defining a career in international relations. We are going through a very difficult time in the German-American relationship, and this won't be news to all of you who've been following very closely the relationship between Washington and various European capitals, but particularly Berlin, that plays such a linchpin role within the European Union, but also further afield in Berlin's relationship with Moscow, in Berlin's relationship with Beijing. So in my appreciation of my own home country, it's important to pay attention to Germany and to think out what could happen over the next 4 years, certainly with a German election also coming up in 2021, because of the critical role that Germany plays at the heart of Europe. What we're experiencing now is an extreme crisis. It is a depth of crisis in the way that we have yet to know it in the German-American relationship. It is deeper, I believe, than the crisis that we experienced in 2003 around the Iraq War, where divisions around political opinion and military engagement in the world saw the German electorate doubt decisions that were being made in Washington. Right now, if you ask any German or if you observe the German news, and I just had the privilege of spending an hour with the Secretary General of the Social Democratic Party this afternoon, my first in-person meeting since March 10th, then you will hear people in Germany describe this as a crisis of confidence in an American political system, a crisis of belief in some regard in the American people. And that's why this is such a moment of danger in my mind, and why we need to pay such close attention, all of us collectively that care about the integrity of the transatlantic relationship. The Germans have felt emotionally, both in person, but also at the political level. And I'll explain why and how that's played out and what we might see over the next 4 years, depending on the outcome of our elections on November 3rd here, how this might play out. But the Germans have felt acutely like the last 3.5, 4 years have been like a death in the family. And I say this because I want you to understand the depth of that resonance and why that is so. And let's just take a historical step back for a moment. All of you know this history. Many of you have lived this history. Again, they are foundational to an understanding of the alliance that was foundational after World War II. But to the Germans, this epically unique decision, an announcement by George Marshall right on the steps around the corner here at Memorial Church in the Harvard Yard, in the heart of Harvard Yard, to decide to rebuild war-torn Germany that had inflicted so much pain on the world, is the touchstone and cornerstone, of course, of the foundation of German democracy. American fingerprints are all over the German basic law. It's effectively its constitution. They're all over the design of West German federalism that is now all of German federalism. And of course, it is because of the investment that people like George H.W. Bush, James A. Baker III, Margaret Tutwiler, Bob Zoellick, and others invested in crafting the 2+4 process to bring together not only a deeply previously divided Germany and unify it, but to unify it in a Europe whole and free, to continue to create a berth within NATO that would accommodate both Germanys. And so not only allow for the rearmament of West Germany after 1955, but then also for an extension and a rethinking of Germany's military role in Europe and beyond its borders, which is something that the Constitution, certainly until 1998, did not prescribe. So there is that DNA that is critical to understand when one looks at why the Germans now feel a relationship with the United States almost in tatters, and where we see a rise in anti-American sentiment across Germany. If you look at opinion polls today, the Pew Research Center just came out with another poll looking at transatlantic attitudes. Germans feel this much like the Iraq War, at least in terms of numbers. 25% back in 2003 felt, and I'm going to read the exact quotation to you, that they have an unfavorable view of the United States. Now we're at 26%, perhaps not that different, of course, but the dip is drastic. 78% saw the United States in a favorable view before the advent of this particular presidency. Germans also no longer trust the United States to do the right thing in international relations, and the same survey bears that out. Only 11% lower than during the Bush years, but nonetheless, that's 10% more than in sort of the most darkest time in certainly modern history. And then worse, from the standpoint of geopolitics, post-pandemic, there's been a strange equidistance that's emerged within German public opinion, where 37% of Germans feel, oh yes, a close relationship with the United States is still essential, but 36%, another third, feel that close relationship with China are at least just as essential for German advancement in the world. And that to me seems to indicate that there is something really amiss here, that we're seeing a cohesion of the West weakening right at the center of Europe. And I should note that other Europeans, Spaniards, French, don't see this relationship or the transatlantic relationship suffering as much. They don't bring the same feelings, the same emotions to the table as the Germans currently do. So there's a trust gap, and then there is a credibility gap. And why is there a credibility gap? I want to talk particularly about the German view on America's role in building the multilateral architecture and why that's so critical to German perceptions of this relationship, but also of its own role in the world. Germany would not be, if not for being embedded in this sort of tri grouping of intersecting circles, which is to say, to be deeply embedded in the values of the European Union, together with its tandem partner France, in leading the European Union in a number of key policy areas. If Germany were not as embedded, and yes, we'll talk about NATO funding in a second, but if NATO were not as embedded as deeply into the Atlantic defense structure. And then finally, Germany could not have become what it is today. And the historian Timothy Garton Ash argued a few weeks ago in The Guardian that the last 30 years were arguably the best in all of Germany's history. And in the article, he traces it back certainly to the beginning of Germany in 1870-71 with the Franco-Prussian War. So the best in German history, and that is only possible because of the confluence of an integration of a multilateral architecture that protected and built a rules-based order, and then globalization that allowed an export-driven country like Germany to thrive in the world. So for an American president, this particular president, to then turn around and over the last 4 years actively dismantle a multilateral architecture in the middle of a pandemic, to step away from a leadership role in the World Health Organization, to enfeeble the World Trade Organization that sets rules around trade, rules of origin, and investment pricing, to withdraw funds from critical bodies in the United Nations. That seemed to be quite head-spinning for many Germans. But as you might imagine, there are other aspects of what has happened over the last 4 years that have felt more searing and have been more problematic. And those, of course, are the expressions by suddenly the American government that NATO might be unnecessary, that in fact the European Union is a greater foe than China, that in fact pushing back against trade surpluses, which are not actually, don't represent the reality of the entire trading relationship, particularly between Germany and the United States, because the facts that the president has dealt with focus specifically on goods and not on services, that is something that needs to be pushed back against, that we are not supportive of the success of other countries around the world, that in that sense, it truly is America first and can only be America first if America wins economically and certainly wins in the race against China. And so the idea that there's a constant dangling of a threat of tariffs over the head of Europeans, but that are particularly angled at German economic success. Particularly, I'm thinking, of course, of the still possible tariffs around automobile parts and high-grade aluminum. Those type of measured attacks against everything that has effectively made Germany what it is, coupled with the personal attacks that this president in particular has levered against the chancellor. And some of you will have seen this, that Carl Bernstein released to CNN a number of comments that were made on calls between the president and Angela Merkel, where he called her stupid. He belittled her. He told her that she was in the hands and the pocket of Russia. He really tried to, in many ways, denigrate her personally. That contributes to this idea that Germans have taken this change that they perceive within the American administration, not just as a passing phase, but as something that says something much more serious about the state of the United States and the way that it looks out into the world. And then there's another critical factor. The Germans are keen America watchers. And Tim mentioned that I will spend 14 hours on German television trying to make sense of the election for a German audience. They are keen America watchers because of this shared DNA and because of how close Germans have traditionally felt to the United States. But they are also watching with great worry some of the dismantling behavior that this administration has brought to the system, particularly the justice system, the system of oversight in a number of bureaucracies, the war against the deep state, quote unquote. That resonates. And of course, the president's sort of fudging, if not outright denial to withdraw and step away from any sort of support to white supremacist ideology, white supremacist views, that resonates with Germany's own history, and it makes them extremely nervous about the integrity of German democracy. I will tell you that it was with great surprise that in January of 2017, I was suddenly invited to be on a panel discussion to discuss press freedom, where they wanted an American to discuss the freedom of the press, where I feel that our First Amendment rights are so, at least then I felt they were so solid and so irrefutable that it seemed odd to share a stage with a Turk and a Ukrainian who, had been suppressed in their expression of open opinion and of opinion that supported democratic developments and the upholding of democratic beliefs in their country. But such is also the change in the media fabric in this landscape. And so Germans watch this with extreme concern. So let's look again, or let's take another step back and take a look at the other issues that have become critical in the German-American relationship. And then let me reflect a little bit on what might change on November 3rd if the president is Joe Biden, and what will not change, and where we need to do some additional work on both sides of this relationship. And then vice versa, we'll discuss a little bit about what it might mean if we enter another 4-year phase with Donald Trump as the US president, what that might mean for the integrity of the relationship between between Germany in particular and the United States, but Europe in more general ways. So the president would say of himself that, in fact, the pressure that he has brought on European nations, particularly on Germany with respect to NATO, is the result that Germany has increased its defense spending by 40% since 2014. He would also say that the pressure lobbied against Nord Stream 2, not least the pressure brought by Ted Cruz and 2 of his fellow letter writers against the election district of Angela Merkel and Sassnitz, the place where Nord Stream 2 is ultimately to connect to Germany, is a success for the American liquid natural gas market and is a success for American suppliers, because of course the Germans did agree to open 2 more ports around liquid natural gas deliveries from the United States to Germany. He would also point out that, leveraging tariffs and constantly threatening the leverage of tariffs will have made the Europeans more compliant, or at least more careful to tread in trade relationships vis-a-vis China, and to quote unquote keep them on their toes or keep them guessing. But of course, this only speaks to partial truths. The Germans decided to increase their defense spending proportionate to GDP in 2014 because of Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea, because there was a threat at the actual German doorstep. Germans are mounting now a critical component of enhanced forward presence, the NATO military mission that is intended to secure the eastern flank, which is a complete novelty in German history. The sanctions threat has done nothing more but to make Germans increasingly uneasy about their investment and their business dealings with the United States. In fact, though Nord Stream 2 is an incredibly embattled, rightly so, I think, project because it doesn't speak to European energy needs, what the sanctions did is it actually pulled Germans closer together around Nord Stream 2. So it actually defied some of the potential objectives that President Trump may have been pursuing. And then finally, the last sort of bigger direct kerfuffle that we saw over this past summer was the unannounced withdrawal of first 9,000 troops, now 12,000 American troops from German soil, which didn't seem to speak to any strategic objectives. In fact, Ben Hodges, the former lieutenant general and commander of European forces in Germany, in my hometown, Wiesbaden, said that this was very clearly a gift to Putin, because withdrawing American troops from German soil, making them less responsive, less nimble, and less capable to supply the kind of military and cyber intelligence that was needed at home, and vice versa, that was needed further afield when you think about securing African shores, when you think about America's role in the Middle East, and then further afield, that was an enormous strategic mistake, and it certainly took the Germans by surprise. So what the Germans have felt over the course of these 4 years is a humiliation and an abandonment, frankly, of an American partnership that was deep in German DNA and deep in the core. And that's why I think this is a crisis that is much more fundamental than the differences of policy. And we had them with the Obama administration, the Germans had them with the Obama administration, but even sort of the deepest, most recent crisis or breakage point between the Germans and Americans, the Iraq War in 2003. Germans feel like they are left alone, and like the chancellor in particular has a bullseye in the middle of her forehead, and that Donald Trump is really focusing on injuring her in the eyes of voters, which is not true. The fact of the matter is that German support for Angela Merkel vis-a-vis Donald Trump has gone up. And it's a sort of bullying rhetoric that he had the American ambassador sort of convey to groups in Berlin at every instance, Rick Grinnell, and then, of course, Secretary Pompeo on his visits to Europe only serve to actually deepen the understanding of Germans, or the feeling of Germans, that the Americans were no longer trustworthy, and that they should focus, in fact, on taking a number of matters in their own hands. Now, that per se is not necessarily a bad development, which is to say, German investment in its own security through the alliance of multilateralism, rescuing, quote unquote, what was left, or what Germans feel what was necessarily needed to be buffered of certain architectural components to ensure peace and stability. So this alliance of multilateralism that they created with France, and that now encompasses countries like South Korea, Taiwan, Japan, Australia, and others, with the precise, goal to really make multilateralism have muscle memory and commit countries, democratic countries across the world, to upholding the rules and rights of liberal democracies, including a push on humanitarian affairs and human rights efforts. And the fact that Germany has turned around and invested so much more in its own security architecture and in its backyard. But again, the causal linkage is not necessarily this administration. It is something that has risen up over the last couple of years and been hastened not by sort of a goodwill campaign, but by a complete breakdown in strategic communication between the German government and the US government. And I would point out one more thing within this, is that because of this sense, this breakage point being and feeling so deep, it's affected an entirely new generation of Germans. My generation was very much raised with this symbiotic understanding of this relationship. I spent a lot of time speaking in high schools. The Social Democratic Secretary General of the party does too. And we both diagnosed this afternoon that young Germans no longer see why it's worth investing in a relationship with the United States. They look at the protests around social and civic rights in this country. They look at the inequality they see in this country. They look at the rhetoric of this president. They hear the misogynistic viewpoints of this president. They hear somebody who decries democracy. They see somebody who is taking apart a system that they were raised on from the inside, and they no longer understand why it would be worth investing in that kind of partnership and that kind of relationship. And I find that incredibly dangerous. I don't know how you feel, but I find that very dangerous, because there are critical and important issues which we must work on together that really will affect the way that we continue to go in the world, particularly with the rise of China, the economic and political systemic rise of China as it extends its brand of authoritarianism, not only across its neighborhood, but it buys itself access and influence through its Belt and Road Initiative within Europe and in critical infrastructure hubs in Europe, in Africa, and in India. That should cause us grave concern. The muscle that China can now muster on the world stage is very different and historic for this balance of power. And then, of course, Russia as the big destabilizer and spoiler in the international system that still plays that critical or that important role that can really disturb the way that our democracies function, that can torpedo, we just saw this in the poisoning of activist Alexei Navalny, who is now recovering in Berlin, that can torpedo democratic developments both at home and abroad, and in general has worked in its both in its neighborhood, but also in Libya and Syria, to destabilize the security environment that links directly into NATO's responsibilities and NATO's remit. So in an effort to hold these other great powers at bay, we're going to have to figure out how to re-anchor and recenter the West. And my message to you is that this will take more work than just realigning American policies toward the transatlantic relationship, because that might be relatively straightforward in a way. And we've done that. There have always been partisan changes over the course of history, and highs and lows in the transatlantic relationship. But this time it's different. And the good news is that Germany now has something to offer. This shock to the system that it felt after the election, when it awoke from its, in German we call it Dornröschenschlaf, this sleep that Sleeping Beauty fell into, deep and confused and disorienting. When it woke up from that about 3 years ago, it actually put structures in place. It preserved critical components of the international system, which can now be put on the table to where, again, we can link arms in a transatlantic fashion. And I think some of those points are already found in the program that Joe Biden, the vice president, as a candidate, has put on the table. And I think those are worth paying attention to. The Paris Climate Agreement. Germany and its constituent parts, which is to say its cities and its federal governments, have continued to invest in building out the implementation phases, or the implementation components of the Paris Climate Change Agreement, and has continued to push European partners toward realizing an EU Green Deal that is economically viable. And so there are parallels with some of the political outlines within the DNC program around renewable energies, without cutting out, of course, some of the key energies that drive US energy markets, including fracking. But when we can talk about that. On Iran, yes, maybe an incomplete and insufficient deal in the JCPOA, but we're going to need a new agreement. And the way that we do that is by approaching our European partners who have tried to keep Iran in check and keep it, quote unquote, functional, keep the JCPOA functional, so that we have some place to restart a negotiation if and when we have a president whose name is Joe Biden. Those are critical components, but also around, again, this alliance of multilateralism, the way to rethink inclusive security within NATO, to think beyond just the tanks and the bombs, but to begin to rethink how we get a public health infrastructure globally right. And you think about Germany's general success in combating this pandemic. What can we learn from that experience? The Germans have something to put on the table there. So in general, this moment of crisis, these 3 years of crisis, have led for Germany to come up with a more robust set of policy priorities that they can put on the table, so that if a president is elected whose name is Joe Biden and in January accepts office, Germans can be met at eye level. Americans can come in with some humility, but that we can together begin to get really things done. Things look a little different if Donald Trump is reelected. As you might imagine, he has threatened leaving NATO, and I have no doubt that he would try to make that a priority of this administration. We'll hear in the debate later this week, where he's tried to make foreign policy a main focus, how he intends to do that. We have also seen not only bicameral, but bipartisan pushback against that, including not only on the troop withdrawal from Germany, but also trying to put barriers in the president's way from dissolving the oldest and most functional military alliance, or effectively dissolving the oldest and most functional military alliance in the world. So I would expect there to be some major standoff between, of course, the executive office and the legislative branch in the United States, but it would torpedo the entire security architecture, not only that frames Europe, but again, that looks toward Africa, and that is a hinge point to any security ambitions that the United States has vis-a-vis China, and pushing back against Chinese overreach in a number of the defense areas, whether it's cyber or classic or sort of nuclear proliferation issues. And I'll remind you that that American and Russian negotiators are hard at work to see if we cannot extend New START and then extend New START beyond that to bring in other nuclear powers, India, China, and so on. So there are key issues of work to get done, even on the global level, where technically the Europeans and particularly the Germans, as the continued lead nation, even though the chancellor will no longer be Angela Merkel after 2021, the Germans play a crucial role in helping recenter and re-anchor the definition of the West. We need the Germans, and conversely, the Germans need us, but we need to redefine that relationship. And my fear is that after 3.5, 4 years of a campaign that is actively, and not just passively, but actively eroded the trust the Germans have in Americans, in the American people, beyond the White House, that this is a dangerous moment. And in fact, we in the United States should then think about, if Germany continues to play and will play, because of its economic power, because of its geographic location, and because of its political influence, a key role in Europe, then we must think about how we rebuild that relationship. And so maybe we need to think about mustering a Wunderbar Together initiative vis-a-vis the Germans, who no longer understand what makes us us. And I think that is frankly been the saddest realization over the last 4 years, that I constantly have to explain the beauty and diversity of this country. And so I'm so pleased that we can have this discussion this evening, that we can think creatively about what elements might be necessary to put on the table if we have an administrative change, or if that is not the case, what we need to do to ensure that the nucleus of the West remains what it has been for the past 70 years, and transforms, modernizes, and gives a younger generation hope and actionable public policy for the future. So thanks very much, and I really look forward to interacting with you.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much, Cathryn, for your wonderful insights. I really appreciate you taking the time to walk us through all of the potential challenges and pitfalls for the US-German and wider European relationship. So we've got a lot of great questions that have come in, and we'd still love to grab more questions from people. So please remember to continue to send them in. We'll try and get through as many as we can in the next 23 or so minutes. So why don't we go ahead and start off with a question from Ben in Portsmouth, who asks, is it possible for the relationship to be repaired nearly as quickly as it has been harmed? Sounds like you maybe are not optimistic about that.
Well, Ben, I think you really put your finger on it. I think not, but I think it's going to, it's going to need a sustained effort. I think, from what I know from the foreign policy people in the Biden team, there's already been some floating and some consideration that, in fact, the first visit, the first foreign trip of President Joe Biden should be to Germany, because, again, of the influence that Germany holds across all of Europe, but also, again, because of this sort of deep sense of personal injury that the Germans feel. And I think because there is this generational chasm that I talked about, I think it's going to need a lot more, and it's going to need, some humility from the American side, which, speaking with my blue passport, we're not particularly good at. We see ourselves as the American creed, extrapolated into these ideas of the indispensable nation, of the lead nation. And so I think in trying to repair that relationship, we're going to have to bring some humble pie to the table, acknowledge what Europe has done during our absence from the international stage, and particularly from the multilateral environment. And so I'm not sure that, unlike in the George W. Bush years, it's going to be to Obama, you're going to just see a lever switch that happens over 4 years, because the Europeans, and particularly the Germans, now have a deep distrust of Americans. They sort of feel like America has come unmasked. And so, the uncle or the grandfather who you so adored and you suspected might have a dark side, that dark side has come exposed. And as a result, they're going to tread very lightly. So I have a feeling it's going to take longer than 4 years, but, who knows? If we flip back into a different political tide here with the extreme polarization in our country, then that could even deepen before it gets better.
So I think this next question really keys in on a critical point that you were mentioning there, that the Germans feel that America has been unmasked for who it really is. But this question asks, do the Germans understand that Trump lost the popular vote of less than half the total population, and that we are not all in agreement with this administration? And how does that play into their views and understanding of what the US truly is about?
That is just a fabulous question, in part because, if you look at the media environment in Germany, and again, it's, by and large, public radio, public television still. The German population is demographically older, skews older, has, a media consumption that's still very traditional. Newspaper readership is still very high. But there, the pictures that make the news, are Charlottesville. And the pictures that make the news are a president who seems to be equidistant to demonstrators, who are there, of every skin color, creed, and political dynamism, speaking up for social justice. But then they still see the Kyle Rittenhouses of this world, and the kind of on-street violence that happens, or the people lining up around gun shops, and they're at very least confused. But the pictures that make the news are the thousands of people at Trump rallies when the president is still openly recovering from coronavirus and calling and effectively still calling the virus a hoax, and or the fact that it's all everyone talks about and no one should anymore. I mean, these are, in as much as they're confusing, these images are confusing to many Americans, they're all the more confusing to Germans or to Europeans. And so while they understand that, and so many Germans have familial relations here, have close linkages to people who served in the US Armed Services, who became their friends and their neighbors. My own hometown, Wiesbaden, is really a German-American city for all intents and purposes. And yet, people just can't understand how, the America that they loved and trusted for so long, elected a man who just is so openly defiant of every convention in international relations and, frankly, conventions of democracy, and has held the faith to him and continues to, support him at rallies and to where we're down to the wire in a presidential election. So that is confusing to the Germans, but it's confusing in part because they're seeing also the most newsworthy and egregious images. So part of what I feel to be my responsibility is to talk about the World Councils of New Hampshire and, the city partnerships that have continued to flourish and the exchange programs that have continued to flourish. And that kind of mutual investment in human relations that will be important rebuilding stones of this relationship as we move forward.
Yeah, it certainly is a confusing time for a lot of people, not just the Germans, but I think it'll be really interesting to see what happens in the next couple of weeks and how the election turns out. And I know we're all waiting with bated breath to hopefully have a smooth transition and not repeat something similar to Bush-Gore or, God forbid, something worse. So we've got a lot of questions about NATO. We'll start off with, is there even a way to imagine NATO without the US? It seems impossible to imagine such a future.
Well, I think that's the exact right question. I mean, NATO, the backbone of not only the defense architecture, but also really down to sort of the materiel, what we think about guns and butter, to a large extent, is American or is American made. And so, of course, NATO has been a boon for American defense contractors because there is also, has traditionally been, of course, an implicit Buy American component there too, or at least, a push to make a greater interoperability possible. And you see this, and there's also a big discussion within Germany and within Europe around the F-35 fighter planes. So it'd be very strange to see, and I think that's also worth talking about, first of all, a political and military withdrawal of the United States from NATO, like, you know, who provides not only the necessary institutional backdrop, but also really provides the military architecture, the fast transport components, you know, that are essential toward resisting first Russia and then again serving as the hinge point to the rest of the world. I don't understand how that would be possible. The Canadians would also be severely limited. But then it also gets to this idea of what capacities do Germans, or I'm sorry, what capacities do Americans then still have to continue to sell their weapons systems to Europeans? What does that do to an American defense industry? What does that do to a Pentagon budget? So there are so many unsolved and unresolved questions. And I think the muscle reaction of the American Congress, because again, that is not what Americans want. The Pew survey points out that 78% of Americans want America to continue to be engaged in the world, and that includes a commitment to NATO. So, you know, first of all, I'm not entirely sure how it's going to orchestrate itself practically between the executive and the legislative, you know, like how that's actually going to work. And then, yes, I do think that that would effectively, in some regard, make, will make NATO in its original design non-functional, and that I think begets a very, very dangerous time for the world.
So this next question about NATO comes from the other side of the perspective. What about the need for Germany and other NATO members to burden share more? It seems they are not pulling their own weight.
Well, that's the old question about what does burden sharing actually mean, and how do we define burden, and how do we define how it's shared? So let me back up a little bit to points that I made in the talk itself. Germany has increased its defense spending by about 40% since 2014. 2014 again was when the decision was made to codify a decision that was made earlier, but around sort of the 2% GDP defense spending. Now, it's been problematic for Germany, in part, again, because of this materiel idea. In the German public, that suddenly means or has come to symbolize that German tanks would be rolling across European streets or on the Russian quote unquote flank. Like it brings back very odd historical images. So to sell the 2% goal to a very skeptical German public has been really the work of every German government, you know, which is all of whom over the last 16 years have been headed by Angela Merkel, but with a coalition partner who has been somewhat more skeptical around these investments. But that has been a key issue. We are now, in part because of the contraction of German GDP during the coronavirus recession, actually much closer to 1.6% of GDP than we ever were. But the real question, I think, for the Germans is what is in those 2%? And here lies the opportunity, I think, because if we think about cyber readiness, if we think about inclusive security, now we're talking about, you know, how public health has become in all of our minds a public policy and public security issue. Are there other components of security that, you know, that are not sort of tanks and bombs that the Germans could be financing, quote unquote, so that you win over skeptical components or skeptical parts of the German public? And I think we are moving forward in sort of modern weapon system, modern defense systems, to an understanding of getting to a better place in integrated defense spending. So in short, the good news is the Germans are moving. The honest news is also they're moving not because of Donald Trump, but because of a changing security environment in Europe. And there are more opportunities to make the case to the German public for that number to begin to read more like 2% in terms of GDP spent for integrated security measures.
All right, stick with me here. Colin, thank you watching on YouTube for your comment, America First. What do you say to people who want America to be first, to be put first, our priorities to be put first, and how do we do that, achieve that, if we're not leading around the world, if we're not the ones helping to set the rules?
Well, I think, Tim, in some respects, you've already answered the question. America First cannot mean, and because of the world that we now inhabit, globalized, deeply integrated, facing a whole set of transnational problems. I mean, we're in the middle of a global pandemic of unprecedented form and, deadly consequence. Climate change, migration, a number of really critical transnational issues at the same time. We're trying to face down competitors in the international system. China, we've already discussed, but Russia still, all the demographic and other forecasts aside, still very much a robust spoiler in the international system, in terms of its tentacles into affecting our democracies and European democracies, but also in its geopolitical reach. So, to try to combat all of those issues at the same time and to keep America safe first, you're going to need that network of allies. That continues to be the United States' greatest asset in comparison to China and in comparison to Russia. Neither of those have allies that they can rely on, with whom they can burden share, with whom they can really tackle a lot of these integrated policy problems without having to, quote unquote, foot the bill entirely. And yes, we can argue about, is the bill sharing enough, like we just did earlier? But the truth of the matter is the fact that you can, cull the best ideas, cooperate with people, create a better, way to find critical solutions, like we are now on vaccine sharing. All that, in my appreciation, we're better off doing in tandem. But that doesn't mean, and so now I'm going to change the America First narrative, that we don't need to clean up at home. Our democracy is not robust. We're constantly being told, and we can see that the norms in our democracy and our discussion culture and the way that we address one another is atrophying, is fading. These fora are too few and far between. And so we do need to do work at home. We may need to make our democracy more resilient. We need to increase our infrastructure spending. We need to rebuild our schools, particularly after this pandemic, when our American school children will be losing time in the classroom, and we need to pay our teachers such that they can do this work. All of that, in my mind, is part of making, America first and keeping America secure. That's my definition. And I think, in all of these fields, America can walk and chew gum. We're mature enough to be able to bring back some of our achievements, but then to strengthen them. And then on the international scale, the way that we're going to push back against these issues at scale is in partnership. And so that's why, getting America's security needs right, in my mind, only works with allies.
Okay, and so now moving on to German politics. How strong is AfD, the Alternative for Deutschland, currently in Germany, and will a potential Trump re-election reverberate with or strengthen them?
I think that's a great question. Look, it's been quite shocking to see how quickly the AfD and populist right-wing parties, so AfD and associated movements, made it into all federal parliaments and then eventually into the German Bundestag. They have been widely sidelined by all the traditional parties. So they have absolutely no effective voice in policymaking in any of the federal states. And in the one federal state where it looked like they could, be part of a coalition, the governor who proposed that coalition was effectively sacked. But in terms of ideational power, and I will tell you just a quick anecdote. When I was at home in Germany over the summer for a very brief moment, there were big protests, not unlike here in this country, around corona measures. And the QAnon conspiracy theories and believers were out in full force in Germany, which is to say that some of the rhetoric that fuels some of the more right-wing debates in these, and frankly, conspiracies in this country have made it across to Germany. And those people do align themselves and walk hand in hand in some cases with AfD politicians or people that are even, on what we would call really the far right spectrum, that are absolutely in a neo-Nazi group. The AfD has been weakened on the inside because of revelations of neo-Nazi membership within the party. And that has led to sort of an identity crisis within the party. But there's certainly a force that everybody is paying very strong attention to. And yes, they would see themselves justified by some of the anti-democratic rhetoric, small d, that this president has been putting forth in his campaigns, weakening the integrity of the democratic system and democratic decision processes.
You've also mentioned that Angela Merkel will not be reseeking election. So what effect will that have next year on the US-German relationship and on the EU, as she's been such a stalwart in the continent's politics for so long?
Well, we have an election coming up. So the short answer is depends. Depends on who wins that election. The German system, as many of you will know, is set up to bring forth generally coalition governments. I fully expect there to be another coalition government in the early fall of 2021. We are already seeing how that could play out. I think there's probably two versions of that. Whereas Merkel's party shares power with the Green Party, which has really transformed itself into sort of a modern centrist party, is no longer really, extremely left-wing progressive, but has those elements in it. And that could be an extremely interesting thing to see. It would be historic for Germany, extremely interesting to see both in domestic and foreign policy. The Greens used to be, yes, the peaceniks, but they've come around to a much more realistic view of things like the transatlantic relationship. So that could be an interesting thing to watch out for. A much less likely coalition government involves the Social Democrats, the fledgling party that is now partner to Angela Merkel's current government, and the far left party. And then that would really raise some eyebrows for the transatlantic relationship, particularly for things like NATO funding. But what is interesting right now is this battle going on between the four white men who want to succeed the most successful woman in arguably German, but also European politics. And they all have interesting qualities in their own right, but none has the same empathetic or identifying qualities as an Angela Merkel. So either way, both internally to Germany now after this long reign, but also on the international stage, it will certainly be a different world without Angela Merkel's calm, collected demeanor.
Well, so then the follow-on question has to be, with so many possible scenarios, do you have any predictions for us as to what will happen next year?
Oh, God. No, I kid. I have many, or I could come up with many. Look, there are a lot of things in the offing. I think, with respect to the German federal elections that will happen likely in September 2021, they always decide that sort of as the year goes on. I think it's most likely that we'll see a conservative green coalition, and that I think there you'll begin to really see a German government push this idea of inclusive security, particularly in the transatlantic relationship, but also really to strengthen the role that Europe can play in this idea, or in this idea that's getting increasing attention around sovereignty. Where can Europe make its own decisions? Where does it not need to depend and wait on American decisions? So those are things around the digital domain particularly, but also in key economic areas. Where can Europe do it on its own? Where can it make itself more independent from the United States? And I think there will be a continued push on at least thinking those things forward. And I think conversely, it's in the US interest to say, look, let's do a lot of this important work in tandem. Let's do it together. Let's figure out the best way forward, again, to anchor, and to save what should still be and needs to be the definition of the West. And let's have a critical and open conversation around that. So I think that's going to definitely be possible with whatever stripes the German government takes. But if you took my money right now, it would be a conservative green coalition.
All right, I know we're at just about an hour right now, but I think this is a really great question to finish up on. So in what ways do improving or disintegrating relations between the two countries matter to the everyday citizen, both in Germany here and here in the US? And what can we do to help improve those relations?
Well, here's the good news. The Germans are fascinated by what they perceive to be the spectacle of this election cycle and what they perceive to be the spectacle of the past 4 years, because they find it head-spinningly confusing and irritating, and they want to step away from it. All those things are true. But the opportunity is in the continued fascination to understand what motivates Americans, and in part what motivates average Americans. What is responsible for the social and cultural and economic cleavage in this country? To what degree do we see those cleavages in Europe? Is this coming? Are these waves coming for Europe? Those are the big questions that I think Germans are wrestling with right now. So the focus on the United States remains intense. They are seeing all the diversity and progressive achievements of this democracy, and that remains very clearly a role model for Germany. So I think there are a number of really critical docking points. And so I think the question says it best. Because the crisis is so deep and is felt so personally, I do think that so much of the remedy lies in these personal connections and in the outreach, in the kind of exchanges, in bringing people to the United States or vice versa to solve problems together. I do a lot of work on urban diplomacy, as I mentioned, and that's been, I think, one of my sources of hope, to see how in this moment of crisis, cities particularly have rallied together to protect the achievements of the Paris Climate Change Agreement, and entire federal states like the state of California have vowed through America's pledge to, quote unquote, remain on it. So I think, in a lot of these areas, there are immediate hook points that we need to build out and amplify. And I think that truthfully, in the person-to-person exchange is where some of the really robust reconfiguration of this relationship can lie. But it's going to take humility on the American side. It's going to take openness on the German side to not just dismiss Americans or be anti-American, which we're seeing a growth of. So we need to rediscover our mutual curiosity for our similarities, but also for the differences. And the differences are there, and we need to find ways of addressing them head on. And coming together in these kind of discussions is one way to do that. And then to take that transatlantically is the next step.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Cathryn, for your time and your insights. We really appreciate you joining us here tonight.
It's really been my pleasure. Really smart questions, a very thoughtful set of members that you have there, Tim. Kudos to you, and I look forward to continuing this conversation in other ways.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone, for joining us here tonight. I really appreciate Cathryn's insights, particularly around the need for citizen diplomacy, a big issue, a big part of our work here at the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire, particularly through our U.S. Department of State International Visitor Exchange Program, which, despite the pandemic, is continuing in a virtual format. So we are really appreciative of the continued bipartisan support that program receives. In closing, I would like to make sure you are all aware and invite you to our first night of the Global Forum 2020 with former Defense Secretary William Perry and Plowshares Fund's Policy Director Tom Colina. That event will be happening on November 10th, starting at 6 p.m. We really hope that you will have the opportunity to hear these two experts' remarks on the challenges of nuclear proliferation, as well as reimagining presidential power around the calls to create nuclear war. Thank you again for joining us. We really appreciate your time. We hope that you have enjoyed tonight, and we look forward to seeing you on November 10th. Have a great night.